A few weeks ago, as I sat down to write this paper, I reviewed some of the literature on scholarship and learning. I cracked open an issue of a leading pedagogical journal and began to read with great interest some of the issues facing university faculty members in the classroom. Inadequately prepared students, we've all heard these, right? Students who focus exclusively on the facts, how students applied spurious assumptions about the world as they attempted to master the subject matter at hand, how they tended to overgeneralize, how they tended to rely on very simplistic reasoning skills, how they had no real theoretical sophistication to inform their disciplinary knowledge. In fact, the authors noted of some 200 students who were asked to complete a complex task in an upper level university course, no two students used the same methodology to complete that task. Their efforts were often successful, their methods idiosyncratic. Further, the authors noted, students lacked the, quote, disciplinary context that provides an integrated understanding where the, quote, thinking, feeling, and behaving part of understanding is an indispensable feature of knowledge. Or, in other words, the authors lamented that students suffered from, quote, significant cognitive constraints. This sounds familiar, right? Perhaps. But the authors were not writing about history majors. They were writing about chemistry majors. Right? STEM students. Those students who very clearly have the skills that will get them the jobs. Or at least, so goes the story. So this paper that this talk I'm giving today really has its genesis in both the scholarship of teaching and learning in history and in science education, and in real issues that I encounter in teaching a senior level U.S. American Environmental History course at my institution, Cal State Long Beach. Brief background on Long Beach, and we can just leave up the cognitive constraints there. It applies from the top down to the students. Mostly at the top. Okay, I'm done editorializing. A brief background. Cal State Long Beach, otherwise known as, quote, the beach. That's how they branded themselves. And that draws in all the kids from around the state who say, oh, I grew up in Wairika. I want to go to the beach, right? So we had 90,000 applicants for admission for next fall. Cal State Long Beach is a comprehensive urban university of some 35,000 students. We are a Hispanic serving institution. Departmental considerations, we engaged in this whole sort of pre-tuning process more than a decade ago with Lendl Calder, who's not here today, and some other folks in the old Quality in Undergraduate Education project back in the 90s and the early 2000s. So for a very long time, our programmatic learning outcomes have reflected very closely the draft tuning DQP that's on the AHA's website. We've been a very skills-heavy department for a very long time, what I think is important about this is, once you've gone through a lot of the curricular redesign, GE redesign and reform that many folks have spoken about today, you get down to something different, and that's what I really want to talk about. That's redesigning courses and individual assignments for courses with intentionality. So, at our school, sciences and liberal arts are located within different colleges, and there's little interaction between faculty members and the two administrative units, with the exception, it's an important exception, of those chairs and credential coordinators whose departments house secondary teaching credential programs. At Long Beach, The disciplines, not the College of Ed, direct the credential programs. And I think that's now becoming acknowledged as a best practice. Further, at Long Beach, we have an unwieldy general education program. It's down to 48 units from 57. So the GE program, in theory, is aligned with, but not wholly reflective of the AAC and U's LEAP outcomes. The institution has adopted the LEAP outcomes, but they're sort of pressed on top of institutional GE outcomes, program outcomes, and student learning outcomes for individual courses. So it's kind of a mess. But to make Mary Ann feel a little better, we had that catalog of transferable courses about 30 years ago. So it just doesn't get any better. Truth in advertising, I've been a chair for 9 years now, and I'm really jaded, so if you can't tell. Okay, so our institution requires all students to complete 3 upper division GE courses. 1 writing intensive course, which is normally located within the discipline except for STEM students, and 2 advanced skills integrated interdisciplinary courses. My environmental history course satisfies one of those interdisciplinary advanced skills GE requirements. So I've been teaching this course now since 1998, but it's grown increasingly more difficult and more complex for me. And it's not just because of the vast growth in scholarship in environmental history. The student clientele for this course has changed dramatically in recent years. STEM majors now make up a majority of enrolled students when I teach the course, and I'm teaching it this spring. 25 of 33 enrolled students are STEM majors. STEM students may struggle, as the author of that essay noted, they may struggle when they take their chemistry classes, but when they show up for my course, they really flounder. They're unused to a heavy reading load. Many have writing difficulties, or they just don't like to write. And I seduce them into writing. They are introduced to historical ways of thinking that many find exasperating because they want to know what's the answer. Because there's always the right answer. And it's also challenging, the course is challenging for our history majors as well, because they encounter sophisticated scientific concepts unfamiliar to them, not to mention the fact that they have to interact with their colleagues in the STEM fields, who think quite differently than they do. Further, students report widely different reasons for taking this course, and that's the first point up there, establishing a baseline. I ask students, what are their goals for this course? I just sent out the email a couple days ago, and I have a spy, so my younger daughter is friends with one of the enrolled students, and the enrolled student is actually a biochemistry major, Facebooked my daughter and said, I've never been asked this question before in any class. What do I do? Answer the question, right? What are your goals for the course? So the STEM students tend to be more career focused. They typically see the course as somehow helping them to be better prepared for their careers, whatever they may be, often in wildlife management or conservation, which I think is kind of a hoot because you can almost not be any more urbanized than Southern California, at least on the West Coast. History majors, on the other hand, report that they're generally interested in the subject matter, which is, they've got this dichotomy in student expectations. And so the question becomes, for me, how can I manage all these competing assumptions, goals, and interests in one upper level history course? And so I have some sort of nitty-gritty individual strategies that I'd like to talk about here. I believe, and I can document it because I'm a data-driven person, I think most historians are, or at least they should be. History instruction can deepen STEM majors' disciplinary knowledge in their own disciplines by illustrating that theories of the way the world works are dynamic and, in fact, fallible. One of the exercises I have students do very early on in the course is work on scientific definitions so that we have a common language as the course progresses. I assign a particular reading from the Wildlife Society Bulletin called Defining Biodiversity that outlines the many definitions of biodiversity in use in professional practice today. So even scientists can't agree on a definition. So, you know, there are things like variety of life, richness, which is the number of different types of items, like species or communities, and evenness, like, you know, are the numbers of species spread evenly throughout an ecosystem. But surprisingly, STEM students often have a quite rigid view of biodiversity that conforms to their particular scientific interest. They typically define biodiversity as, and this is straight from a student paper, one of the better science papers a couple of years ago, as many many animals in a healthy ecosystem. Now this presents a problem for a number of reasons. First of all, ecosystem is a social construct. Second of all, animals does not include plant matter and other biotic organisms. So, you know, they're coming to this with they're very essentialized ideas about what biodiversity is. We then discuss in this class how biodiversity has been measured. And here it is that history students, rather than the STEM students, seem to really get the point much quicker. Biodiversity is a relative term, a construct, and it changes over time. And what you're looking at, that photo, is actually how they measure biodiversity in a project that's called the Pacific Rocky Tidal Flats Project. It's right off the coast of Monterey at the Hopkins Marine Station. And we use counts. I have them read actually old accounts of tidal species counts in Monterey, conducted at, this is much bigger, but conducted at the 1 square meter scale in the 1920s, the 1930s, and in recent years. And so they can see over time how the numbers, richness, variety, and evenness have dramatically fluctuated. We read historical reports and contemporary accounts by, among others, Doc Ricketts, who is one of John Steinbeck's friends. Okay. Another thing we do, we interrogate, we question the meaning of particular words, like conservation and natural. And for this I use a very nice text. It's actually the only text I use that addresses things like wilderness. But I use Mark Spence's Dispossessing the Wilderness, Indian Removal, and the Making of National Parks. And they really like, most of the STEM students have been to Yosemite. There's a couple chapters on Yosemite there. We introduce how human society and agency has created this narrative of protecting nature. And in particular, they're really interested in how it is that policymakers, which is a career goal of many students, STEM students, thought that they had to remove the local Miwok from Yosemite because the tribal people's presence there was not natural enough. And this really kind of blows their minds, which is a lot of fun. Okay. We also use historical data to enhance knowledge of current issues, and I use a lot of maps. There's a map from U.S. Geological Survey from 1852 that shows that the beaches in California, the California coastline was about 600 feet farther west than it is today. Okay? And we can talk about reasons. We don't really need to. But we also talk about wetlands. How did the beaches, where they all go surfing, because they're at the beach, you know, how did the beaches change over time and what led to those changes? Again, sort of decentering the idea that nature never changes, which is really what environmental history is all about. We also look at how human activity has led to species decline and resurgence. And at this point, I'm able to interject the historical content because we talk about the militarization of the region. And for those of you who don't know, Southern California's military bases are home to more wildlife than any other area in urban Southern California. And so, for instance, at the Seal Beach Naval Weapons Stations, which is just across the Orange Curtain into Orange County, there is a project where they do an annual count of burrowing owls. Yeah. Okay. We do a couple of other things, and I'll sort of speed through these. Field inquiry, we looked at environmental inequality. I send them out to find examples of environmental inequality. Who eats the fish off the Long Beach Pier? Which Department of Fish and Game says do not eat. And you can see one of the oil islands back there and a nice layer of Southern California smog. Okay? Environmental planning. How is it that certain environmental sites didn't end up the way they were planned? This is the old Pacific Electric Railway right-of-way. They were supposed to, when they redeveloped it, include lots of fruit trees for the homeless and for poor people. Didn't happen. This is also a service learning course, and I think this is really sort of key to the success of the course. I send them off to work at places like Algalita Marine Research Foundation, which is mapping the Great Pacific, North Pacific garbage patch. And they also work for the Friends of the Los Angeles River. That's the left side is what the LA River looks like after it rains in LA. They go into and they do surveys of nesting owls in oil fields, and they shadow refinery safety workers, union workers. A civil engineering student had his placement with Long Beach Organic, and he actually designed the native plant gardens along the Colorado Lagoon. So some of the benefits, okay. I think service learning, having STEM students and history students in the same classroom helps each other appreciate the disciplinary methods specific to their own disciplines. Community engagement is identified as a high impact practice. Part of the high impact practice for community service stipulates that you need to have reflective assignments, reflective essays. And this leads to self-awareness and a sense of personal responsibility for the environment. We have closer alignments of outcomes between LEAP program and GE outcomes. And also, it's helped me reconceptualize environmental history as a field. In a lot of places, environmental history is taught. There might be an environmental history course and there's an urban environmental history course. That shouldn't be the case. We're an urban society, right? What does wildlife look like in the city? Okay, thank you.
52% of our students are white, 48% are students of color. You see the breakdown of students of color and different races and whatever. And here we are Okay, 93% of our students of color come in with deficiencies. Now, these are students who come for the AA degree, AAS degree, and Associates of Science degrees. So we have a lot of work cut out for us. And I already told you this, so I'm going to jump here. So what kind of math can community college students learn in a history course? Money. You know how to count money? How to figure out how money translates and whatever. If you're wondering where you can go with this, think about continental currency and how it changes during the Revolutionary War. Look at Confederate currency and see how it changes during the Revolutionary War. What did it mean in early American history to move to the dollar from the pound? And, you know, what is the euro worth today in terms of our money, and what was it worth when the euro was introduced? So there's all different kinds of possibilities with money. Change over time in populations and balances of accounts. You can talk about the national debt, costs of war, costs of social programs. There's all kinds of possibilities there where math factors in. Rates, interest rates, rates of change in occupations, population migration. Percentages, okay, how many are wealthy, how many are poor, how many are on welfare, how many are in the military, how many women are in higher ed now, how many women were in higher ed in 1970. All kinds of possibilities there. Statistics, well, what kinds of charts do we want to talk about? Well, census data is wonderful. We can talk about employment reports, migration reports. There's all kinds of materials available on the web that allow students to work with these kinds of statistics. Graphs, charts, maps, timelines, elevations, longitude, latitude, breakdowns of population, occupations, national spending, again, educational levels. Very, very simple calculations. I used a primary source material in one of my classes in US history to 1800, a woman's account of moving from Philadelphia to Kentucky. How many miles was it? How long did it take? Then have them look at airplane schedules now and look at train schedules, and what's the difference? All right, well, this woman took 2 months to take, you know, on a trip that, you know, they got jammed up as many people did during those years, but now they could have done it in about 3 hours. So it's really kind of interesting to look at this kind of stuff. And the students get it, and they start realizing that they're unconsciously working with numbers, and they finally come around to it. And I'll tell you how I know that. So travel speeds over time. Think about, you know, going before even the national road, how long did it take? And then with the national roads and the other road systems that develop, with the railroads, okay, on the water, from sailing ships to steamboats on the rivers to steamships, or those interesting steam and sail models, okay, moving on to the new propeller-driven ships. Real differences, they can understand this kind of stuff, and they're actually doing math and they don't even know it. Slopes, population, GNP, educational achievement, again, shows up in slopes, unit conversion and measurements, acres to square miles, hectares to square kilometers. This gets really, really kind of interesting. And I'll show you a map and talk about this a little. How can one teach quantitative skills in history? Clearly, in standalone courses, we have books that use maps and graphs. We have all kinds of online resources that allow students to deal with maps, graphs, statistics. It's just up to us to use them in different ways. But it's much easier, I think, to basically teach quantitative skills by linking with other people. Since 1997-98, I have been linking courses with economics faculty. Let me explain something. We have different kinds of courses, okay? A linked course is where basically I teach my course to all of my course outcomes. I know that my students meet those outcomes and they cover every part of their syllabus. My colleague, whether my colleague is in economics or in anthropology or in environmental science, teaches to those outcomes. But then we work together, we share resources, we share ideas, we talk about what we're doing in our different classes, and we are naturally linking what we're saying in our class with what they're saying in their classes. And it really, really becomes one of these kind of collaborative affairs. We also share text. And I'll give you an example. In my history course, I assigned a biography of David Douglas. Okay, my course was Pacific Northwest History. This wonderful biography of David Douglas that was put out by Sasquatch Books has his wonderful illustrations of people, plants, landscapes. It's really a remarkable book. The environmental scientist, PhD out of Cornell, she read it as well. We talked together about how we could bring these things together. There were maps in there of where he had gone, what tribes he had encountered. My first assignment was to basically meet out different Pacific Northwest tribes so the students actually knew who they were talking about when they were, or who they were reading about when they were reading David Douglas. We also used another book called Mourning Dove. And some of you may be familiar of this, basically a memoir of a Native woman who grew up in basically the upper Columbia area of Washington State and ended up on a Colville reservation. But it takes her from life before contact with really white populations to basically becoming a part of a white person's world. Very, very interesting work, tied into some of the maps that we had with David Douglas, okay? So you're having this reinforcement of change over time and looking at Native populations. We used many other resources, but we brought many things together in walking tours, which I started about a decade ago at our school. We're very close to Discovery Park, which was one of the most beautiful parks that you will find anywhere in the United States. And if you come to Seattle, I'll drag you through the park because I walk it every day. It was basically an Indian fishing settlement. It became a United States Army fort, and it has now become a Seattle park. And the Indians have a section of it, okay, the Daybreak Star Center. So I go walking with the marine biologist. We have all these opportunities. Okay, other thing, learning communities, interdisciplinary studies where you are with somebody in economics, you are with somebody in anthropology. And in anthropology, for example, we are talking about different communities in the Pacific Northwest again, and we're looking at Native communities, we're looking at kind of Oregon Trail and other white migrant communities that came across. We look at the slaves moving in after, basically, slaves moving into Oregon. Okay, that's an interesting little piece, okay, but we also look at African Americans moving in during the First World War and then again the Second World War, so more opportunities there. Geology is another possibility. I've been talking with one of our geology profs who wants to link with me doing the natural geology of the Pacific Northwest with the human history of the Pacific Northwest. It makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not the only one doing this, okay? Some of the big guys do it. Penn State's been doing Civil War history and geology for years, and Princeton's Red Lodge project started in the 1930s, and this is looking really in the Dakotas. So there are these kinds of models that are out there for you. Just showing you in one of my classes in a single day how you hit math. Okay. 1920s, industrial growth, right? Real wages rose 20%, stock market investments increase, okay? We look at the rate of increase. Commodities, more bought and sold, okay? Decreases in union membership from 5 million to 3.5 million. Agricultural hard times, okay? Okay, the Turks finally stopped the blockage of Russian wheat, right? So European demands dropped 75%, okay? How does that affect the wheat farmers of the United States? What are the accrued debts that they have from buying all those tractors and tearing up the land? Okay, what about the blights and the dust bowls, the effect of that? Okay, farm failures, bank failures. You see how math comes into all of this? And then look at the stock market crash. Just look at those little numbers. Do you have work in quantitative history in front of you? Yes. Okay. Now, here's a really simple one, okay? Northwest Ordinance. The map gives you the opportunities to deal with longitude, latitude, mileage, acreage, okay, the split up of this one territory into 5 different territories. The piece next to it gives you a small sample of basically the way the townships were set up under the Northwest Ordinances, right? 6 square miles by 6 square miles. You would not believe how many of my students cannot multiply 6 by 6. Or when you break down one of those sections, 640 acres, so it's broken into quarters. So how many acres in a quarter? And my first answer was 70. All right, this is what I am dealing with. I'm going to just keep going on these. But you can see the possibilities that are here. You can go into census data. You can have a wonderful time with census data. And we use those, and you know, the most recent ones, people can actually find their ancestors here. Here's some questions that are really loaded with opportunities for quantitative use. How did World War I and its aftermath affect Americans in general, and one group in particular? Veterans, immigrants, African Americans, women, union members. How many statistics are out there that can help you help your students learn the history while they're doing a little math? How well did government programs do in getting the U.S. out of the Great Depression? I'll jump down to the one below that. Compare and contrast federal economic relief policies of the 1930s with those of the Great Society. Okay? Or what about booms and busts in the United States? Okay? Compare one boom and bust with another one. And boy, they really want to look at this recent one, because many of my students are there as a result of the economic bust. Have some fun. Okay, in a length class, explain the economic theory and the math behind the history. Look at the American Revolution, the Federalist system, international trade, land sales, migrations, industrialization, transportation systems, land sale, let me see, terms, okay? What is inflation? How does it work? Where do we see it in the American past? Same with recessions, depressions, booms, busts, and whatever. And in the economics, we get a little more sophisticated, okay? Here you have basically price levels and the real GDP. What's the difference? And our students are able to work with this and put it in the context of the history. Here's an easier one, the Phillips curve. You see the rate of inflation going up one way, and you see unemployment rates going the other way. Now, this one ends in 1973. Put on this the last 20 years, and you're going to see a really, really interesting different line. So these are some of the things that we do, okay, in anthro and environmental science. Native white population changes in availability of resources, numbers of hunters, fishermen, farmers, manufacturing employees over the years, immigration patterns, demographic change. You can look at the gold rush, you can look at the Oregon Trail, the Great Migration, World War I separate from World War II. You can do all kinds of things like this. And industrial developments, and the benefits and costs to air, water, land, and climate, something every environmental science wants his and her students to know, right? So these are just some of the things that I play with my students. And I'll tell you something, working with the economists have taught me an awful lot about economic theory and how to use statistics better on my own. Working with the environmentalists have made me really underscore environmental issues in my US surveys and my Latin American history surveys, as well as in Pacific Northwest history. It's these kinds of cross-fertilizations and these discussions that very often happen over lunch that become extremely important, not just for me, but for my students. And you know, if they work through this, they do have the opportunity to basically have more confidence in themselves, they have better skills. And you know, I'm going to say one last thing about STEM, because I live in STEM country. In the community colleges, we have many STEM programs. They're getting funded left, right, and center. And what do they prepare students for? They prepare students for entry-level jobs, all right, in the STEM industries. Entry level. Well, guess what? The science is always developing. The technology changes, okay? The math is pretty constant. The engineering has some modifications based on the other stuff. What other skills do they need? What other skills? Okay? They need the skills that we have. Perspective. Audiences. What are the different audiences? Identifying and resolving problems. Really creative thinking, coming out of the box. Historians, we're all over the place, right? Is that fair? So what I'm saying, I think, is, and I'm trying to hit both STEM and quantitative, there are opportunities. Our community college students really need them, and they deserve them as well. Thank you.
Quick background, if I may. I am a professor of history, but also director of an honors program at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And our students come at Georgia Tech, and certainly the honors program, from all disciplines, all over the place, especially, of course, as you might imagine, engineering. And I'll give a brief shout out, a PSA, to my colleague Steve Usselman, who will be talking about this in somewhat more detail tomorrow. But in the honors program, what we try to do is to teach courses that are very interdisciplinary, frankly outside the catalog courses, maybe even sometimes outside of social sciences credit, which is a bit of an issue. But I think the question that I try to grapple with in the courses I teach is, how can you teach an interdisciplinary course and still be true to your own discipline? And the one I want to talk about very briefly this afternoon is a course called Semester in the City, Engaging English Avenue. It is, for lack of a better term, a service learning course. I actually don't like the term service learning, so I've developed a new one, Case Studies, Connecting Academic and Societal Engagement. My problem with service learning, it just sounds kind of aggressively Protestant, and I just wanted to set that aside. But what we try to do is to look at a particular neighborhood, which is a mile to the west of Georgia Tech, and here are some undoctored photographs. Here's the context, the issues that we address. English Avenue is number one in almost all categories in the city. And this comes back, I think, to the question of calling it service learning. A lot of students who take the course are very eager, very energetic about wanting to do the service. They want to do something. They want to solve the problem. After all, they're engineers, most of them. This is sort of the way they work. And then they go on to work for McKinsey and Deloitte later and solving other people's problems. But my argument with them, and it's sometimes a difficult one to make, is that you've got to do the learning first. You're dealing with people here, and you don't just come in like a consulting team into a neighborhood and tell people what to do and how to do it. And so a lot of the learning has to do with visiting the community. We take them over in a bus. In fact, one time we took a SWAT team officer with us, and he pointed out, asked the students, where's the drug dealer on the corner? And it was always the grandmother, we take the students to the neighborhood and have asked them to write about their observations. This was on the second day of class. We get people from the neighborhood to come into the class and meet with us, and trying to create those connections between students at the university and people in the community. And I think that, oops, I'm backing up there a bit. One of the questions is really, how do you go about studying a neighborhood? How do you go about working with the people in the neighborhood? But the point I try to stress very repeatedly throughout the course is that before you're able to address, much less to solve, some kind of societal problem, you have to know where that problem came from, that it has a history. Now, you would say duh to that. A lot of my students say, oh, this hasn't really occurred to them before. This is something we need to think about. So, we read a lot about the history of Atlanta. I've passed around, or John has very kindly passed around copies of the syllabus, and happily there's a good deal of literature on the history of Atlanta, and so there's a lot of stuff there. But I also have them do individual research projects using, yes, primary documents. This is one of my favorites. These are the Sanford fire insurance maps of there are all sorts of years in the 20th century. But the point is, each student has to do a history of a particular street. And they do it by looking at the Sanford maps. They do it by looking at other kinds of documents. This is the Blue Book of National Negro Business. They do it by looking at the city directory, which is enormously painful, but it's a good document for them to use. And after they've done that, after they've read about the larger social and race and space context of the city of Atlanta over time, after they've looked at particular streets in the neighborhood over time, then they're to devise with some of their classmates and colleagues a group project to do something with or in the community. And my only standard is that the goal that the project be attainable and sustainable, something you can get done and something that can stay done, at least one would hope. But the other point is that they're working with the neighborhood association, not on it. This is not a lab, and these are not always successful experiments that can be reproduced in the lab. These are, after all, human beings. And I think that approach is, to me, not just intellectually interesting, but it's also very important. I think it's fundamentally decent. And I want the students who take the class to know the neighborhood, not just as a physical space, as a set of houses in varying degrees of collapse, but I think they need to know the people and to work with the people and to do so with some understanding of what's come before. That the situation in this particular neighborhood did not just happen yesterday. And it didn't happen because of some kind of natural evolution, natural causes. There are questions of politics, there are questions of race, there are questions of class that are very, very important here. And I think my point as a historian, teaching interdisciplinary classes to a very wide variety of disciplines, in fact, almost none of my students are history majors, I want to show them how history and how historians can work. And I think that there are three important outcomes here, beyond the standard outcomes that we talk about critical thinking and writing and so forth. I want these students to gain an understanding of the larger context, the bigger picture, and how it matters, not just in this neighborhood, but how it matters everywhere. I want them to get some sense of how they can add to that picture by doing their own research. And above all, I want them to gain some understanding that these people that they encounter in the neighborhood are people. They're not academic abstractions. I'm not trying to turn my engineering and science students into social workers or social saviors. But I am trying to make them what I call engaged citizens. This comes back to a term that's come up in the conversation this morning from time to time. And it's not citizenship in terms of how a bill becomes a law and what one must do and so forth. I've had some experience myself being on the board of directors of a number of nonprofits, and sometimes in doing that, I've noticed that some of my fellow members of the board are rather naive about the problems that they're trying to address. And so, part of my goal in teaching this course, and frankly in all of them, is to, urge people not to be a dope, don't be just another insufferable elitist or an elitist problem solver, that somehow you, because you're educated and frankly white and middle class, can do things. And I think it's that part of the education, that part of the larger education, the beyond general education for students, that history does especially well. It helps us see that bigger picture. It helps us bring it into a closer focus. And I think history, perhaps more than many other disciplines, perhaps most, helps us see our subjects with a human face. Those are outcomes that are very hard to measure. And in some cases, I don't even try. But I do think at the end of the day, at the end of the semester, I've done this course 5 years in a row, if my STEM students can begin to see themselves as STEM students with the H in there, then I say, okay, I'm happy to embrace them as fellow historians, perhaps honoris causa. Thank you very much.